The foot. Pull the boot off, and the skin comes with it. The sock has fused to the flesh. What peels away is gray and swollen and wet, and it does not hurt anymore. That is the worst sign of all. No round did that. No shell. The soldier did everything right. He marched where he was ordered and stood where he was posted, and his feet came apart inside his own boots while he did it. The army had seen this before. It knew how to stop it. It had the cure written down, printed, and filed in its own manuals, and it let it happen anyway. Then it happened again. A different war, a different boot, the same wrecked feet. Then again. Trench mud, a frozen foxhole, jungle water, desert sand. 4 wars, 4 boots, and every time, feet the army already knew how to save and did not. 100 years of the same failure. The question is not how the army let this happen once. It is how you lose the same page 4 times. Here is the strange part. The army did not have to figure any of this out. By the time American infantry reached the front in the First World War, the answer was already written, already printed, already handed over. The cure showed up before the disease did. The trenches where it was learned were not American. They were British. The first winter of the war, 1914. The men are standing in water, not for an hour, for days. The trench floor is mud and meltwater. It does not drain, and there is nowhere dry to put a foot down, so the foot stays wet and cold and still. That combination is the whole disease right there. Wet, cold, still. Nothing has to freeze. The blood vessels in a cold, soaked, motionless foot clamp shut and stop delivering oxygen. The tissue begins to die from the inside, and the man is still standing on it while it happens. The foot swells. It goes numb. In the bad cases, it turns black, and it goes to the surgeon. Here is the cruel part of this particular wound. It does not announce itself with pain. Pain needs living nerve, and the nerve is dying. So the worse it gets, the less it hurts. And the day it stops hurting is the day the foot is already lost. It comes on quiet. It takes its time. It signs its name by going silent. The British called it trench foot. And in that first winter, it nearly broke them. Tens of thousands of cases, whole battalions limping to the rear on feet that had rotted inside their own boots, with the enemy nowhere in sight. An army can lose a campaign this way, bloodlessly, from the ground up. The wound had no drama to it, and no heroism. Just a young man who could not stand, carried to a casualty station to sit and stare at feet he no longer recognized, and behind him, tens of thousands more exactly like him. A modern army bleeding out through its own boots. They refused to lose it twice. What they did next is the hinge the next 100 years turns on. They solved it, not with a wonder boot, with a routine. The routine had 4 parts, and none of them were expensive. 1. Dry socks. Every single day, carried up into the line and changed on a schedule, so no man stood in a wet pair longer than he had to. 2. Grease the feet. Whale oil or animal fat rubbed into the skin, a crude barrier against the damp. 3. Get the boots off at least once in every 24 hours, so the foot could dry and the blood could move. 4. The one that made the other 3 real. An officer whose job was to check, to physically inspect his men's feet and answer up the chain for their condition. Prevention became a command responsibility, not advice. An order, written into the manual, enforced from the top down. It worked. Where the routine was followed, trench foot nearly vanished. The British had taken a plague and turned it into a matter of socks and schedules and supervision. Then they did the thing that mattered most. They wrote it down. The Americans arrive into all of this late, in the last full year of the war, and inherit the whole answer. The doctrine, the socks, the grease, the inspection, the entire hard-won system, handed over by an ally who had already paid for it in amputated feet. The United States Army did not earn this lesson. It was given the lesson, finished, in writing. There is no shame in borrowing a hard lesson. Every army learns from the last one's dead, and a lesson paid for in another man's feet is still a lesson learned. The shame never comes from where the cure came from. It comes later, and it comes from a filing cabinet. The result shows in one clean number. American trench foot across the entire First World War came to roughly 2,000 cases. 2,000 against a force of millions. The Army's own medical history records that the injury was never important to the American Expeditionary Forces. For once, the fix and the war showed up at the same time, and the feet stayed whole. An aid station in the Meuse-Argonne, the autumn of 1918. A soldier carried in from a flooded trench. They cut the sodden boot away, and the foot underneath is pale and swollen and wrong. On the table beside him, within arm's reach, sit clean, dry socks and a tin of grease. The cure that would have kept his foot whole, right there next to the man it did not reach in time. Even in the war the Army handled well, the shape of the whole story is already visible. The cure is never missing. The cure is in the room. The First World War ends, and the Army is holding the page. It knows precisely how a foot rots. It knows precisely how to stop it. It has the whole system in its own files, printed and bound. Keep that page, and this video is over right here. The Army did not keep the page. 1944, the Ardennes. The page is already gone. 26 years later, a new generation of American soldiers is dug into frozen ground in Belgium and the forests along the German border, and they are losing their feet by the tens of thousands. To an injury the Army had a manual for, to an injury the Army had, in living memory, already beaten. Take one of them, a rifleman in a shallow foxhole in the Hurt-Gen forest, a dark, soaked pine woods where the fighting has ground on for weeks. His hole is half full of freezing water, and there is no room to move. His boots are the standard leather M1943, not waterproof, and nobody has greased them. His socks have been wet for days, with nowhere to dry them and no dry pair to change into. Every condition the British routine was built to break, he is living all of them at once. One cold morning he goes to pull his boots back on, and his feet will not fit. Swollen, dark, and stopped answering, and the litter-bearers carry him out with no wound anywhere on his body. The aid station he reaches is already full of men exactly like him. In the Hurt-Gen that autumn, the cold injured came in beside the shot. Multiply that man by the theater, and the number stops being survivable. Across that winter in Europe, the United States Army recorded roughly 71,000 cold injury cases. Take the stricter count, the pure cold injuries with nothing else attached, and it still lands near 46,000. That is the manpower of entire divisions, taken off the line, not by German machine guns, but by their own feet. The 71,000 is not the Battle of the Bulge. It is the whole winter, and it climbed week after week from the fall onward, long before the Bulge began. The worst single week came in the middle of November, more than 5,000 men frozen out of the fight in 7 days, and the curve was still climbing when the Ardennes erupted in December. Picture an entire season of it, one week feeding the next, cresting when the fighting was at its worst. Now the question that turns a tragedy into an indictment. Why? Why did the Army that wrote the book on trench foot stand in a European winter and watch it happen at 40 times the First World War scale? The Army answered that itself, in its official medical history, in language I am not putting in its mouth. A calculated risk, it says, was taken by command decision to bring forward ammunition, gasoline, and other combat requirements to the exclusion of winter clothing and footgear. To the exclusion of footgear. This was not a shortage nobody saw coming. Somebody with authority looked at limited trucks and made a choice. Shells forward, boots and overshoes later. The overshoes that would have kept feet dry were not lost and not uninvented. They sat in depots to the rear, stacked and waiting. By the middle of November, Patton's Third Army had overshoes for 1 man in 4. 3 of every 4 soldiers walked into the coldest fighting of the war without the single item that could have saved their feet, while that exact item sat in a warehouse behind them because the trucks were full of something command wanted more. The same history adds the sentence that is the whole indictment. The fundamental and all-pervading reason, it says, was that the lessons of the past had not been learned or heeded. Their phrase. The British routine from the last war, their own cold injury experience from the Aleutians and Italy a year earlier, all of it either not understood or not thought to apply. The page existed. Nobody opened the drawer. The paperwork even records the pace of the neglect. The first serious winter clothing order was not cut until the middle of August, and a system for swapping wet socks for dry ones was not designed until October, with the cold already in the ground. This is the detail the ending turns on. The ammunition was never late. The shells came forward on time, every mile, because someone decided they mattered. It was the feet that waited. Hold the 2 images side by side, because together they are the crime. A depot behind the lines, pallets of overshoes stacked to the ceiling, more than enough to matter. And out of the front, that rifleman in his flooded hole, lifted onto a litter with no wound on him, carried to the rear past the very trucks that had room for overshoes and chose to carry shells. The men carried off those fields did not simply thaw and go back. The lucky ones lay for weeks while the dead skin came away, and a great many never got the full feeling back, marked for life by a winter they stood in for a supply decision. Others lost toes. Some lost the foot at the ankle. Rifle companies were pulled out of the line to recover, thinned in the middle of a campaign by no enemy at all. A few years later, the same cold caught American troops at a frozen Korean reservoir called Cho-Shin, and that fight has its own video on this channel. Same feat, waiting on an answer the Army already owned. That is twice. Twice the injury, twice the cure within reach. And this time, the Army did not merely forget. It chose, on the record, and admitted the choice, on the record. Surely it keeps the page after this. The finding is printed in its own official history, bound, filed, impossible to lose. 1966, the Mekong Delta. No snow anywhere. The feet are rotting anyway. This is the act where the last excuse dies. There is no cold to blame now. There is no cold at all. The Mekong Delta is warm water and warmer mud, rice paddies to the horizon, and the infantry crosses them the only way a man can, wading, often to the waist, sometimes for days with no dry ground to stop on. Warm water does slowly what cold water does fast. The skin stays soaked around the clock. It swells and softens and breaks down, and the rot moves in. The soldiers called it jungle rot. The doctors called it tropical immersion foot. Same family as the trench. No ice required. The cold, it turns out, was never the point. One man's version of it runs like this. He steps off the dike at first light into brown water up to his chest, and he does not come out for 3 days. He eats standing in it. He sleeps sitting against a paddy bank with his boots still on, because there is no dry inch of ground to take them off onto. His feet have not felt open air since the patrol began. By the 3rd day, they have gone soft and white and swollen inside the leather, and he can feel them less and less, which is the part, though he may not know it, that he should fear the most. There is one image in the Army's own Vietnam medical history that says all of it. A soldier's foot, pulled from a paddy after 3 days, chalk white and wrinkled and swollen, and running across the ankle a sharp line at exactly boot top height. Below the line, ruin. Above it, ordinary skin. The boot itself had drawn the border between the wrecked foot and the whole one. The waterline of the flood he stood in, printed onto his own body. The cost was not small, and again it is the Army saying so. Tropical immersion foot, the history states, often accounted for more time lost from combat duty than all other medical causes combined. Not more than any single cause, more than all of them put together. More lost strength than malaria, than every fever and wound and accident on the sick roll, than everything else the war did to a body. An enemy that never fired a shot, quietly emptying the line. By the Army's own conservative count, severe immersion injury struck 3 or 4 of every 100 men exposed to that wet across 4 days. And in the units that lived in the paddies for weeks, it came around and around. The prevention was no mystery, and by now it should sound familiar. Keep a man's feet dry for 1 day between soakings. Boots off, feet up, socks changed. A stand down on dry ground for every couple of days in the water. The same idea the British wrote in 1915. The same idea buried in the Ardennes, relearned a 3rd time in the heat. What broke it was simple and damning. Men who could not get their wet boots off at night, made to march and stand and sleep in water to the waist. You cannot dry a foot you are never allowed to take out of the water. Now the boot, because the boot is where the betrayal lives. A solution existed, and it was not exotic. A tropical boot, canvas and leather instead of solid leather so it could breathe and dry. Low on the instep, small screened eyelets, brass drain holes, put there on purpose to let the water run out instead of pooling in. Let the water leave. That was the whole idea. The Army called the finished design the M1966 Jungle Boot. One detail is worth getting right because it often gets mixed up. The famous feature of that boot, the Panama sole with its open, self-cleaning tread, solved a different problem: mud and grip. The thing that actually fought the rot was humbler and sat lower down, those small brass drain holes. Water gets into a boot no matter what you build. The only question a boot really answers is whether the water can get back out. The Army had been developing that fix since the end of the Second World War. The drainage, the ventilating insole, the tropical construction, worked on across the 2 decades after 1945, and not standardized and pushed to the troops in the numbers that mattered until 1965-1966. Sit inside that gap. Call it 20 years between knowing how to drain a boot and strapping the drained boot onto the man in the water. For 20 years, the answer existed as a drawing, a prototype, a thing the Army fully knew how to build, while the soldiers of the meantime went into the paddies in all leather boots that did the opposite, that sealed the water in and held it against the skin until the skin gave out. In theory, the drained boot was solved before Vietnam was even a war. In the paddy, the man was wearing the problem. The pattern finally shows its whole shape. The trench, 1914, wet and cold. The Ardennes, 1944, wet and frozen. The Delta, 1966, wet and hot. 3 wars, 3 climates that could not be more different, and the line running under all of them is not the temperature. It is a wet foot, a boot that will not let it dry, and a fix the Army already held and did not hand over in time. The cold was never the cause. The cold was this year's weather. The answer sat on a shelf the whole time. 2003, the road to Baghdad. Now the boots are cooking. The old standard boot, the black leather one, carried a steel plate in the sole, a puncture guard against nails and stakes. Reasonable in Europe, fine in the mud. Set that same boot on the sand of an Iraqi summer, on ground past 50 degrees Celsius, and the steel does what steel does. It soaks up the heat and holds it, and radiates it straight up into the sole of the foot. Black leather drinks the sun from above, the steel bakes from below, and the foot cooks in between, blistering and swelling inside a sealed hot boot, on ground hot enough to burn a bare hand. A soldier feels it build across a day on patrol, the sole of the boot going warmer instead of cooler as the sun climbs, until every step comes down on a surface that is slowly cooking the foot it is supposed to protect. A dismounted patrol on the hardpan outside Baghdad, the summer of 2003, halts, and a soldier pries a boot off a foot that is one long blister. No shell did that, no enemy. The ground and the boot did it between them. There is no mass casualty figure here, and that is the point. Not an apology for the lack of one. This is the century's smallest version of the injury. Blisters, not amputations, and the fix was smaller still. Pull the steel plate, use lighter materials, build the boot in a tan rough-out leather and nylon that breathes instead of roasting. The tan, hot-weather combat boot reached troops within a year or two. The Marines first to walk away from the black boot for the desert. Here is why the small version is the worst one. Every excuse the earlier wars could offer is gone. No tens of thousands of casualties forcing anyone's hand. No 20-year research program to finish. The injury was minor. The fix was nearly free. The lesson was 100 years old and printed in the Army's own histories. And the Army still sent a boot built for a European winter into a desert and had to be corrected. When the cost of remembering dropped to almost nothing, the Army still could not clear the bar. The sum is the whole argument. 4 wars, 4 boots, 4 different ways for a foot to come apart. Wet, frozen, macerated, cooked. In every one, the fix was already known before the shooting started. Dry socks and an inspection. Overshoes in a depot. A boot with holes to let the water out. A boot without a slab of steel in the sole. None of it expensive. None of it hard. None of it waiting on a breakthrough not yet invented. The problem was never the boot. The problem was never the money. Every single time, the answer already existed. Sometimes decades ahead of the war. Sometimes on the table in the room. What the Army lost, war after war, was not the technology. It was the memory. And once you look at which memories it kept, even that word is too kind. Consider what an institution actually is. It is not the soldier. The soldier remembers. He remembers for the rest of his life, in every cold morning, in feet that never came all the way back. His body keeps the lesson, whether he wants it or not. The institution is the thing above him, the manual, the depot, the supply plan, the officer who signs the order and is gone before the next war. And notice what that thing never forgets. It never forgets the ammunition. Every war, in every climate, the shells come forward on time. Because someone with authority decided the shells matter. The institution has a flawless memory for the things it values. What it forgets, every single time, is the feet. So here is what it really is. Not an institution that could not remember. An institution that remembered the ammunition and ranked the feet last, war after war. Because the man who makes the call has a full truck and a coming retirement, and the man who pays has wet socks and no vote. A foot goes numb because it is dying. This institution was never numb. It heard the lesson, wrote it down, and decided the feet could wait. Again. They fixed the boot. Every time, eventually, they fixed the boot. What they never fixed, in 100 years, is the ranking that puts the boot last. The whole cure would have fit on a single page. Dry socks and a day out of the water. A few brass eyelets. A steel plate pulled. That page has been in the drawer the entire time. Same feet, same file, same failure. In the mud, in the snow, in the paddy, in the sand. The page is in the drawer tonight. Somewhere, a soldier's feet are wet, or cold, or too hot, and the answer is already written, exactly where it has always been. And if no one reads it in time, someone pulls a boot off a foot that has stopped hurting. The skin comes away with the sock, and the file stays shut for the next war. If you want to go deeper, the vault where I keep the full script, the research, and everything that did not make the final cut is linked in the description. Subscribe, and I will keep pulling these apart, one piece of gear at a time. And if you want the cold version, The boot that froze feet at the Chosin Reservoir, that one is waiting for you in the playlist.